things that I was going to say have just been said, but that's all right, save for you a little bit of trouble. Of course, the banks were crucial in bringing this crisis to a head. It had been brewing for a long time. The land crisis, shall I call it, or the environment crisis, has been brewing for a very long time indeed. And I think there's another crisis which doesn't get much of an airing about the inducement to invest and to make productive the whatever industry we have left. And I'll come back to that. But it was said that the banks had always used land as collateral, and that isn't really true. I think it's quite important to look at the history of the financial system over a quite long period of time. I mean, not very long in the history of English banking, but a critical moment occurred in 1971 with competition and credit control, a policy change promulgated by the Bank of England with the approval of the Treasury, which put the banks in close competition with the building societies and other financial institutions. And it was then that they began to take up mortgage lending as a major part of their business. Up to that point, mortgage lending was done by building societies on very different principles from the principles operating in banks today. A much more conservative, calmer set of procedures which didn't give rise to the rampant inflation in house prices that we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years. But competition and credit control went even further. I mean, it promoted a competitive mindset in the banking industry, which hadn't really existed up to then. Banks had made, sort of tolerable profits and got along. Those who are against that kind of system call it financial repression. But by golly, when they lifted the lid on something they didn't know how to control. A whole series of deregulatory measures were taken after that, which further increased the competitive struggle, and banks were concerned to maximize their market share. This has proceeded steadily throughout the last 40 years. It led to a tremendous amount of leverage in the banking system, which made them very fragile. It led to their reliance on market sources of funding their own activities, which subjected them to the vagaries of what's called market sentiment, pessimism and optimism fluctuating from time to time. And when the market becomes pessimistic, the banks are starved of funds, and that's what actually brought the crisis to a head. So their balance sheets were really unsustainable. The role of mortgage lending is exceedingly important for the reasons that have just been explained, that if everybody thinks that house prices can only rise, then borrowers want to borrow more than they should, and lenders want to lend more than they should. And the result, of course, is the self-fulfilling prophecy that house prices will rise. That's what we're still experiencing. Nobody has actually tackled the question of whether banks are a suitable vehicle for mortgage lending and done anything to restore a kind of separation of function. Banks used to lend chiefly for the promotion of trade, export trade in particular, where there's a long lag between accruing your costs and getting your returns, and working capital, and even for longer term investment. these were productive activities. They don't do it now. They lend on unproductive things, assets that already exist. And as their lending increases, the price can only increase. And that's what we've observed. So the change of function as lenders and the pressure to increase their lending by more than their funding base could comfortably support left them in a very vulnerable position when the crisis broke across the Atlantic and found its way very quickly here. I'm very interested in the fact that someone in the Treasury, when Northern Rock, which was the first thing to go here, began to crumble, he said, we're worried that we, meaning the Treasury, we're worried that this might affect the real economy. I said, for heaven's sake, go back and tell the Chancellor to prepare for war. This is bound to affect the real economy. There was no understanding of the connection between the financial system and the real economy in the Treasury. And for this, I blame my profession. I'm an economist. I'm rather ashamed of it because we've taught them that money and the real economy are separate entities. This is just wrong. And it led them to this mode of belief. Now, I mentioned another crisis which hasn't had much of an outing, and that really is the failure of investment in productive activity. I know British industry is, well, pretty much on its uppers. There isn't much of it left. We farmed it out to other places. But there seems to be absolutely no investment in improving the technological base of productive investment. This is partly because the banks find mortgage lending so profitable, but also I think there is something wrong in the general health of the real economy. And I urge you to watch that space. Now, what can be done about it? I sort of despair, to be honest. In the interwar period, Montague Norman, a famous governor of the Bank of England, maintained that although the Bank of England was at that time a private institution, it always acted in the public interest. And now we have a nationalised Bank of England that seems to me to be acting entirely in the private interest. There is no appetite to change the kind of mindset that brought about competition and credit control. The activities of the banks are seen to be entirely the province of the private sector, not to be interfered with in any way by the Bank of England. Now, this is insane for the following reason. The bank stands as lender of last resort. The Treasury stood as lender of last resort in the present crisis, as you know, with its bailouts. And at the same time, they say, well, we'll do all that, but we won't bother to look at your assets and take a view on whether these are sound. And this is the source, really, of the fact that the financial sector gets all the gains and socializes its losses. Some kind of protest really needs to be mounted on this matter so that the Treasury and the Bank of England really do understand that they have a responsibility for the stability of this potentially very fragile set of institutions. We know that they're fragile. Economists have been saying that for a couple of centuries. And if they are, then if the Bank of England and the Treasury are going to support the liabilities of the banking system, they jolly well better look at the assets and say something when they feel that the balance sheets are becoming much too fragile. That is something on which you can mount a protest. This is a long way from the land issue or so it might seem. But it isn't, because of course urban property and housing are part of that general issue. We need a banking system which is sound and not liable to fall over at the slightest difficulty, which we have had before the crisis broke. And to some extent, we still have. They've improved their liquidity slightly, they've improved their capital substantially, but they are still not, in my view, very sound institutions. Thank you.